Hey everyone, it's Justin here, America's Honest Tax Accountant from Number Crunch Nerds. So the $1 million question of the day is, how much can you actually spend in retirement without running out of money? Perhaps more specifically, how can we actually test in numbers, using real-world market return data, if a retirement funding strategy like the 4% rule actually works? In fact, here's exactly what we want to be able to do. We want to be able to take our actual portfolio values, broken out by tax status type. So in other words, fully taxable brokerage, tax-deferred accounts, i.e. traditional IRA, and after-tax accounts, i.e. Roth IRA, and we want to be able to apply actual market returns over any 30-year historical period for a diversified bucket of asset classes, including large cap equities, small cap equities, long-term treasuries, short-term treasuries, corporate bonds, real estate, and gold. And we want to be able to apply the historical returns for the asset classes listed below using any portfolio allocation within these asset classes that we want. We want to see if our portfolio would survive any combination of 30-year historical market periods while using asset allocations as desired and described above, while simultaneously having dynamic annual distribution rates to fund retirement that can range from 3% to 5% on an after-tax basis. So to accomplish this, I completed the following steps. Step number 1, I went online to NYU, the Stern School of Business, and I downloaded market return data that they had nicely summarized for the following 7 asset classes that we just mentioned above for the period from 1928 to 2025. The summary includes large cap equity as represented by the S&P 500, US-based small cap equity, 3-month T-bills, 10-year Treasury bonds, Grade B AA corporate bonds, real estate, and gold. Then going to step number 2, I built out a portfolio weighting input schedule where you can dynamically allocate 3 portfolio buckets by tax status type, in other words, taxable, deferred, or after-tax buckets, between the 7 asset classes that we just listed, and for which we have all of the historical data included in the background of the calculator. So as an example, if we were working on our regular taxable bucket right here, we could, just as an example, allocate 10% to large cap equity, 10% to small cap equity, 40% to 3-month treasury bills, 0% to 10-year treasury bonds, 30% to grade B AA corporate bonds, 10% to real estate, and 0% to gold. We can then also follow the same process for our pre-tax retirement accounts, as well as our after-tax retirement accounts. We can structure the portfolio allocations for all 3 buckets as we determine to be appropriate based on our investment styles, our risk tolerances, and other factors that you consider when setting up a diversified portfolio. So now, putting steps 1 and 2 together, the formula to determine the portfolio-weighted historical rate of return for any given year is therefore asset class number 1 historical actual return multiplied by portfolio weighting to asset class number 1. To that, we will add asset class number 2 historical actual return multiplied by the portfolio weighting to asset class number 2, and so on all the way down to asset class number 7. Okay, now going to step number 3. I built out a dynamic starting year toggle where you can enter any year between 1928 and 1995. Once you enter the starting year, the calculator will update to determine the portfolio weighted annual return for each year within that 30-year period that both follows and includes the starting year that you select. In other words, if you enter 1928 right here in the toggle, then you will be testing your portfolio to see how it would survive based on the portfolio allocations you give it within the 7 asset classes for the 30-year period between 1928 and 1958, and the results would tell you that based on the actual market returns for those 7 asset classes during that time period, combined with your portfolio allocations to each of those 7 asset classes, whether or not your portfolio would support you through a 30-year retirement with an annual distribution rate that starts somewhere between 3 and 5% on an after-tax basis and increases annually for inflation. Also, take a quick note right here that 1995 is the last possible year of entry above, because 1995 plus 30 years equals 2025, which is the last year for which market return data is available as of the making of this video. Okay, let's hop over to the Number Crunch Nerds 4% distribution strategy calculator itself and go over how we enter the data. So as you can see over here in the legend, the blue colored cells are going to be the input cells for this calculator. Now, starting right here in the brokerage inputs, we have the initial portfolio value, and that's going to be broken out, as I said, between taxable accounts, pre-tax retirement accounts, as well as after-tax retirement accounts. Now, for purposes of this calculator, you could do this by spouse, or you could do it on a combined spouse basis. And the first thing you're going to enter are your initial portfolio values as of the start of retirement. And we have talked in numerous videos on the channel about how to estimate something like that if you are not quite at the retirement age yet. So for purposes of this calculator, I will assume you are familiar with that. And therefore, just as an example, we're going to enter about $900,000 right here in the taxable account. We have just over $1 million here in the pre-tax traditional IRA account. And then right here, we will assume about $400,000 in after-tax retirement accounts. The next item to select is going to be your distribution rate for the first year of the calculator. Now, you can choose the same percentage across the board, or you can mix up the percentages as you see fit. You will also be able to toggle them at any time based on the output data that you're seeing. And depending on what percentages you put into these 3 columns, you will see your combined pre-tax distribution rate right over here, as well as your combined after-tax distribution rate right over here. And so this will give you some opportunity to test out different strategies, both on a pre-tax distribution basis as well as an after-tax distribution basis. And then over here in this row will be the calculated dollar amount of the distribution for each of the 3 buckets for the first year contained within the strategy. This is your 4% rule right here. At the moment, it is actually toggled to what could be called the 5% rule, at least on a pre-tax basis, or it might be called the 4.18% rule on an after-tax basis. And if you want to get exactly to 4% on an after-tax basis, you simply have to adjust one or more of these distribution rate toggles until you arrive at your 4% goal right here, or whatever your goal happens to be. Then right here in the next row, we have the dollar amount of distribution for the first year within the strategy. After that, we have your effective tax rate, which you can adjust in these 2 cells right here for the fully taxable brokerage as well as the pre-tax retirement accounts. Alternatively, this one over here is just going to remain 0, since this is the column for Roth IRAs and other after-tax retirement accounts. And then finally, at the bottom right here, we have the after-tax distribution for the first year within the strategy. Now going down here into the portfolio weightings section. We talked briefly about this earlier, but let's just demonstrate. Perhaps I go in here and say, you know what, I want to allocate more to large cap for this particular portfolio or strategy. So I'm going to change that to, let's say, 25%, just as an example. Now right here we have a couple of checks. The first one simply tells you qualitatively that the column must sum up to 100%. And then down here at the bottom, it tells you how much you have to take away from the allocation, or how much you have to add to the allocation in order to get the total back to 100%. So if this is a positive 15%, it means that I'm 15% over on the allocation, and I need to take 15% away from something else. So let's say I go in here and decide to take away, 10% from that. So I'm going to do 20% on that one. And then I'm going to take 5% away from real estate. And now you can see that we are back to 100% allocation across the 7 buckets. You probably also noticed that this right here, all of the numbers in this column, as well as this historical average rate of return, which is portfolio weighted, was changing every time I made a change change above in the portfolio weightings section. And that should make sense because, as I told you before, the rate of return for every year within the schedule below is going to be based on not only the actual market return for each of these 7 asset classes for the year in question, but it will also be based on what allocation you provide to each asset class in the portfolio weightings section right here. Okay, now going over to this general inputs section right over here. The first toggle is going to give you the ability to switch between all of the historical data and just some average rate of return that you decide to type in. So for example, if I just want to test out an average annual rate of return, I can define that percentage to be any amount that I want right here. And then if I toggle this from an H to an A, all of the portfolio calculations will update to be based on what I type in there. I added that functionality into the calculator just so you can use it as a benchmark to test out any average annual rate of return that you want. But I do believe that the epic value contained within this calculator is the ability to use the historical actual market data. And more than that, you are not limited to only these 7 asset classes right here. You can add to this calculator the data for any asset class that you want. If you want to have 7 asset classes like is right here, but you want to change what some of them are, or you want to add more asset classes so the portfolio analysis can be even more diversified, either of those options can be easily done within this calculator. Now coming down here, let's take a look at this output section. It says right here, does the nominal net account balance go negative at any point during the 30-year period? And scrolling down right here, if the answer to that question is yes for any year within the 30-year period, then a yes will be populated right up here at the top of the column. Same thing right here for does the present value net account balance go negative? Because in the portfolio detail analysis, which is over here to the right on my screen, we calculate both the nominal account balance for each year within the 30-year period, as well as the present value of the account balance for each year. Okay, now take a look at this top row, the historical average rate of return portfolio weighted. What does this number mean right here? 6.7%. It means that if you got the market return for the 30-year period between 1928 and 1958 for these 7 asset classes right here, and your allocation to those asset classes was like this, then your 30-year average rate of return for that time period, portfolio weighted, is 6.7%. And remember that this average rate of return right here is after you took an annual 4% distribution, which was also adjusted for inflation on an annual basis. And actually, to be more specific, for this exact example, it's a 4.1% after-tax distribution that has been adjusted for a cost of living or inflation increase of 3% on an annual basis. But the big takeaway I want you to look at right here in this section, what are these yeses saying to us in this exact fact pattern as we have set it up? It is saying that if you start with these account balances right here, and you take a 4.1% after-tax distribution in your first year, adjusted for a 3% cost of living on an annual basis, and you allocate your portfolio in this manner between the 3 buckets, and if you did that for the period between 1928 and 1958 based on the returns that actually occurred in those years, this strategy right here would not sustain you for all 30 years of retirement. The net account balance between all 3 of these different account buckets, if we scroll down here one more time, right here in year 26, it went negative. And this portfolio, as just described, did not satisfy the 4% rule to get you through 30 years of retirement. Now, on the other hand, many of you are aware that the 1928, 1929 years weren't particularly good in the market. What if you retired instead, let's say in 1955, and you got 30 years of return from 1955 to 1985 without changing any of the other inputs over here that we have previously discussed? then suddenly you can see that this portfolio setup does not go negative over the 30-year period. If we go down into the detail, we can see that actually in one of our portfolios, potentially we did go negative. However, on a net basis between all three portfolios, the 4% distribution strategy still held up under the market returns for those 30 years and these portfolio weightings based on these starting points right up here. Remember, the ultimate question here, as first laid out in 1994 by Bill Bengen, who is generally considered the founder of the 4% rule, and later re-emphasized by the Trinity study that took place in 1998 at the University of Texas, San Antonio, is generally stated as follows. How can one structure an initial inflation-adjusted annual distribution of 4% from a diversified investment portfolio to ensure the sustainable lifelong consumption of savings over a 30-year retirement period without the fear of exhaustion, while balancing longevity risk against the need to maximize quality of life? Well, with the all-new Number Crunch Nerds 4% distribution calculator that is portfolio weighted and uses actual returns for any 30-year historical time period between 1928 and 2025 that you define, we now have a dynamic analysis tool to help us figure that out. And not just in words, by the way, but in numbers. The Number Crunch Nerds 4% distribution calculator separates those who just think about retirement funding casually as just something to be pondered on a lazy afternoon, from those who actually sit down, crunch the numbers, and make a realistic retirement plan based on a combination of their own actual portfolio data combined with real-world historical market return information. Who sleeps better at night? Is it those who are confident that their retirement funding strategy will work? The folks who've laid out the numbers? The folks who've outlined a plan? Or is it those folks who just guess? I don't know. Only you know what makes you sleep better at night. The all-new Number Crunch Nerds 4% distribution calculator is included with your purchase of my tax season 2026 prep and planning class, which covers 2025 tax prep and 2026 tax planning. The 2026 prep and planning class is currently in full swing, just as you're listening to me right now. And you can watch my video FAQs about the class in the link in the description below this video. How much can you realistically spend on an annual basis to enjoy your retirement to the fullest, while being confident that your portfolio will sustain itself through market upturns and downturns in the future? It's the number one question on the minds of many Americans who are approaching or have already arrived in their retirement years. As I said, the 2026 tax season prep and planning class video FAQs can be found right now in the link in the description below this video. You can leave your future to chance, or you can learn how to plan it all out. But just remember that whatever you choose, the only person who is ever going to know or care is you.